Paul Hosa, the self-proclaimed tactical historian, and today we have another episode of Inside the Mustroom, where I sit down with law enforcement professionals from around the world to hear stories from the front line of the forever war, the war against crime. Tonight we have Mike Norton of the British South Africa Police, one of the most unique police organizations in the world. We will learn what it was like to be a police officer during wartime in a nation whose name you'll no longer find on a map, Rhodesia. Hello, I'm Paul, the self-proclaimed tactical historian, and today I sit with the legendary Mike Norton of the British South Africa Police Special Branch, perhaps one of the most unique law enforcement agencies in the world. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
I'm not so sure about the legendary. Thank you very much. that infers that I'm fairly old, which of course I am. But Paul, look at your first question. That the origins of the BSAP. The BSA company, which was formed by Cecil Rhodes on a royal charter to colonize Africa in the days of when that was the right thing to do. Started in about 1893, 1894, coming up into what was then Matabeleland and Mashonaland. And they had to have a security type force, and it was called the BSA Company Police initially. And that was essentially a military format. I guess until about 1910, 1915, when Salisbury, being the capital of what was then southern Rhodesia, became a small town, or a fairly large town, I suppose. A police element of that BSA company did actually sort of start to generate. It really came about in 1923, when Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia as it was, actually became a self-governing colony from Britain. And then the BSA police came into force as essentially a police force, dealing with crime, dealing with horse theft, dealing with all the things that were unique at the time, and that those members were specifically dealing with that aspect. There was still a part of the BSA company police in those days was still involved in militarily, but there were still small uprisings in those days amongst the Shonas and the Matabele. But that, as the years went on, died down. The BSAP itself, by the time the sort of 50s and 60s arrived, was divided into typically British type structure. You had your uniform branch, who were the guys with the uniform, on the motorcycles, in the squad cars, who dealt extensively, solely with crime. You had special sections because of the peculiarity of the country. One of them I remember being the cycle theft unit, because in those days the local population essentially operated on cycles, and it was a major thing to have your bicycle stolen. You got quite touchy about it. Then the CID evolved, Criminal Investigation Department, which were plainclothes individuals drawn from the uniform branch by dint of aptitude and whatever, and that was investigating items like fraud, homicides, the more serious type crimes. Not to say that the uniform branch didn't involve themselves; they did indeed. Then
was there a rank structure? Were they considered detectives, or did they have a different title?
They did. The rank structure of in the modern time, the British South Africa Police. Remember, this is colonial time, so that the races were segregated, and not only by what's the word I'm looking for? Only because of it just wasn't accepted that the black members could actually become officers. It didn't mean to say that they were not good people or that everyone didn't work together. They did. They did indeed work together. So the African police started with the level of constable, which of course is typically British, and the highest you could go as a black individual, that particular point was sub-inspector, which was the very edge of the white ranks. The white ranks, people started at patrol officer, which I guess you've got to put down as your sort of squad leader. You know, a typical rural station, let's say in the bush somewhere, consisting of maybe 30 members of the police, would be probably run by the next rank up, a section officer, assisted by 3 or 4 patrol officers and probably 15 or 20 constables, sergeants, and without question, every time a sergeant major who was responsible for the discipline and control and making sure the camp was run properly and all the rest of it. The ranks then went up to be section officer, inspector, which then became regarded as the first commissioned rank. You've got a big, if you're a uniform branch, you've got a big badge on the top of your cap. Then went up in typical British fashion, chief inspector, superintendent, chief superintendent, right up onto the commissioner of the police. So that's how the rank structure worked.
Just out of curiosity, the rank structure, was that decided through an exam? Did you study to get promoted to the next rank, or was it done on maybe merit, or how did that work?
Combination. From patrol officer to section officer to inspector was done on exam. After that, it was done on, it was a very typical British. Seniority was terribly important. And unfortunately, that caused some square pegs to end up in round holes, because the guy might have been 5 years senior to the best guy, but because he was senior, he got the post. That, after 1975, changed dramatically when the correct participants were placed in the correct places.
And for uniform branch, maybe we can just get into a little bit briefly, but typically how would a day for them work? They would show up to their precinct or station house or camp, attend some sort of roll call, and then be sent out to certain sectors to patrol or police, or how does that work exactly?
Well, if you let's take for this, there's 2 examples to give here. One is the urban stations. Let's take, for example, what was then Salisbury. The 7 o'clock shift in the morning would come on, and that would be there would be a parade held. It was not a formal parade, but it was more of a, yes, I guess you're right, a roll call that everyone was in place. We used to call them B cars. The response car drivers would be allocated their vehicles. The patrolling guys would be given their allocations of areas and given information as to what to look for. And then would go a 9-hour shift of patrolling, receiving reports of crime, investigating crime at the lower level, getting statements, in fact, drawing up a complete docket. From a sergeant upwards, generally the policeman could draw up a docket that would be handed to a prosecutor, who would look at it, having gone through their member in charge, and say, fine, I can prosecute on this. It was the police were very, very, very well trained, and shortcuts were just not accepted. It had to be done properly. You had the major rural districts, which I guess was a smaller scale of that. And then you had the very rural stations, which maybe comprised 1 patrol officer and 5 constables and a sergeant. It was a little bit less formal there. But nevertheless, their work was conducted in exactly the same way. But now we're talking pre-hostilities. So we're talking here up till probably in real terms, 1972.
Now, before we get into special branch, which I want to definitely cover here, one last thing. Oftentimes when I see videos about the BSAP, I see these, very good-looking men on horseback. Was that a specialized unit?
No, what happened is, let me go through the depot training, as we called it. We didn't call them academy. Remember, we were British. It was again because of colonial times we were segregated. The European police, as we called them then, and the African police trained in separate depots. They received basically the same level of training. It was just in different fields. The European officers were trained to be the leadership element, and the backbone of the BSAP, which were the black officers, were trained to be right from the ground up in police work. It comprised 6 months of starting off with the good old squat bashing. It was still, the British were great on their squat bashing and marching and parades and inspections, and your room had to be absolutely immaculate and your bed made in a particular way. Otherwise, you got punishments. You got to go and dig trenches, or if you really were not particularly good, you ended up in a little cell for the weekend. So it was not, you had to get yourself together, and everybody did in a very rapid way. It was not brutal, but there was definitely strict discipline. Some of the squads actually did equitation. They were allocated to do normally a slightly longer period in depot, and they would take over the horses, because we still in the 70s still use horses for ceremonial parades, opening of Parliament, all sorts of things like that. The various shows around the country. There used to be agricultural shows around the whole country during the winter, and the police would put on a horse team, doing equestrians, doing show jumping, doing all that kind of stuff. So it was, and then towards the middle of the 70s and later on, the police did actually have a mounted unit. It was not as big as the Army's Grey Scouts, but they did have a mounted unit within the support unit, which I also need to tell you about.
Perfect. Let's so before we leave the academy stories, are there any stories you have personally from the academy that you recall?
I could keep you going all night. We had as usual, as typical in this particular part of the world, we had our pub upstairs, where we tended to finish about sort of 5:30, 6 on at the end of a weekday, and we would go up there. We were supposed to have only 3 beers. That's what we were supposed to have, but of course it always got out of control sometimes, and all sorts of escapades happened. One I got to remember of the bugler would wake us up from the parade square at 5 o'clock every morning. In those days, we kept our rifles with us in our. We were not in barrack blocks. We were in rooms shared by 2, because we were considered up and coming officers, I suppose. A great character we had with us, a notorious beer drinker. He woke up at 5 o'clock in that morning with a particularly severe headache, not liking this whatsoever. So he crawled to the door, took out his rifle, and fired above the bugler's head. Well, you can imagine the bugler went from the reveille to a hasty squeal and disappeared off somewhere. Well, of course, that got him into quite a bit of, in fact, it got us into all of us into a lot of trouble. There was a lot of emphasis on group punishment if something went wrong, because they reckoned that he was only the perpetrator, but you were all at fault. So we spent many hours running around the parade square, rifles at the port. But look, it was all that's the kind of thing we had. Look, we had lots of. It was a great training exercise. It was very. We did obviously all the physical stuff, but then we did the lawn police. We all learned to type with 2 fingers very well, which I do to this day. We had assault courses, and we had an element of coin training. Even in the days when I joined, which is 73, it was obvious the war was going to hot up and whatever. So we all received counter-insurgency training, which made us reasonably competent in the bush with our weapons.
And just real quick, it's very obvious that there were several characters that ended up in the BSAP. How did people typically, as we used to say or do say now, come on the job? How did you actually get into the BSAP?
Okay, in the 50s and 60s, it was a sought after post by a lot of British people who the hardships in England in those times were somewhat great. And at one point, I think the BSAP was probably 50% British immigrants who'd come into the country and joined up. That slowly died down. But the way you would typically come, if you joined as a regular out of the military, out of the wartime, you basically needed a reasonably good qualification. You needed at least 5 O levels. O levels is the British qualification, sort of upper school. If you had A levels, which is the upper level of education on the British system, fine, no problem. They would look at you. You had to be a certain height, and you had to be a weight in proportion to your height. I think that at that point when I joined, you had to be what is 5'10"? I think it's 1.68 or 1.7 meters was the minimum height. Eyesight had to be good. It didn't have to be perfect, and you had to be able to march, be in proportion, all the rest of it. So it was quite a strict criteria to get into that. So there were a lot of people joined. Often what happened with farmers, if there were 2 sons and the older brother was going to take over the farm, the younger brother then went and joined the police and did his career, did his 3, 5, whatever years it was, and then by then the older brother probably got more established, and there was room for him to come back to the farm. So it was a very good career, and that's how people joined generally. Once 74 came, Rhodesia had conscription since 1968, where if you were white and you could walk, you had to join one of the military forces. So obviously the army took the most, but in 74, you could actually then join the BSAP, is what they called a national serviceman. At that point, you would join for a year. You would receive basically the same training, but after a year, you would go back to civilian life for a short time. If you wanted to go to university, you would go to university. If you had a job, you would have a job, and you were called up on a 6-week basis. Basically, it's 6 weeks in, 6 weeks out, 6 weeks in, 6 weeks out, which was obviously, as you can understand, highly disrupting if you were in a commercial business. So quite a lot of us just said, okay, look, we know we're in for a while. Let's just join. It doubled our pay. It definitely gave us quite a few more perks, and it gave us a choice of preferential postings as well. So it was worth becoming a regular in those days. So a lot of us, I mean, of my call-up squad of, I think it was 20, 12 of us joined as regulars. So off we went. We were now regular policemen.
Did you always want to be a policeman growing up? Did it just sort of happen? How did you have that? What's your origin story, your personal origin story?
Okay, I'll get my personal origin story. My uncle farmed out in a farming area about 90 kilometers north of Harare or Salisbury, called Mvukwis. He was a very successful farmer, and I used to visit him on a frequent basis. I got to know the rural policemen there, because you went to played rugby, you went to the club, they were all part of the group, and I just got to know these guys in a particularly good way. And when called up came, and you were faced with a little brown envelope. In my case, I had the choice of saying the army or the police, and I thought, well, hang on, I think I'd rather go to the police, to be honest, because I think it's going to be a little less, not regimented. What's the word I'm looking for? A little bit more varied. As I'd been advised by the guys I'd met in the BSAP, who all said, if you can get the BSAP, but also get into it, because it's a very different world. And you certainly, are used in many different roles. So that's how I actually made that choice.
Fantastic. And ultimately, you would end up in what is called special branch, right? Going back to our original conversation. Can you talk a little bit about those other departments or branches we didn't mention?
Okay. The uniform branch, obviously we discussed this criminal investigation department. Then we had the paramilitary unit, which was called the support unit, which was basically white officered black troops. who became basically integrated into the war as a military force. That's what they were. But they were made up of British South Africa Police members, and you could transfer in and out of that as if you wanted to. We had various subunits within the CID, crime prevention, homicide, all that kind of stuff. Most of the special branch guys came from CID because it was a noted career path in those days. So you went CID, and then if you showed particular aptitude or interest in the intelligence gathering role, you could apply for transfer to special branch. Special branch had various desks. They had the foreign desk, which dealt with embassies, foreign nationals in the country, any kind of espionage that might be happening on the level of that's the non-military sense. We had nationalist desk, which looked at all the people who were now forming armies to fight the country and all this, but still were probably in the country. Then you had T-Desk, which was terrorist desk, which is the one I was assigned to, which was basically intelligence covering for the war effort on whatever scale was required. There was another urban unit, which was basically to deal with low-grade intelligence on citizens involved in activities that were not conducive to the well-being of the state.
One thing I'd like to get into is one of the things that I find very unique about the BSAP is that they do have this paramilitary slash, basically military element where they're actually going out there and engaging, insurgents. I don't think that we see this in most law enforcement agencies, that this is very unique. Is this all basically due to the war? Is that just a circumstance?
Paul, yes, without question. Let me give you an example of certainly from the uniform branch side. In the area that I controlled for a large part of the struggle, there was a police station called Goromonzi, and that comprised a chief inspector, 2 section officers, 4 patrol officers, and probably about 60 or 70 other ranks. Now, they were in the middle of the zone which was affected by the insurgents at that particular time. It was not unusual for them to be ambushed, doing about duties which might be regarded as simple police duties, maybe going to where a store robbery occurred, not conducted by the insurgents, because that would then become the special branch's function. But the insurgents learned that the police were still active, and they would then obviously lay on ambush. These guys had to be armed. They were still dressed in their police uniforms. And many contacts happened with the ordinary uniform branch guy going about what should be his normal duties in the areas where the insurgents crept. Remember that by the end of '79, the liberated areas it probably comprised 80% of the Rhodesian rural areas. So it was not, there was no, if you're in a rural area, you had to know what you were doing with rifles and as basically as a paramilitary. So that's what happened on that sort of aspect.
So now we were going to get into your specific role, right?
Okay. What would happen earlier in the 70s up until about 75? Typical of police forces or whatever, people were transferred from X to Y to Z because that was thought to be the way. You shouldn't spend too much time in one area. The hierarchy eventually realized that actually it was completely in the war situation completely counterproductive, because it took you a long time to get to know your area properly, and a long time to establish what was important and who was important and who was to be trusted and not. So generally we got left alone. I got posted to Enterprise Base, which actually is from the edge of Salisbury, is 23 kilometers. So that's how close the war, a major part of the war got. It got into Salisbury during, you've seen my interview on Op Enterprise, and I was put there in beginning of 78, and then I was there the whole time until the end of hostilities in 1980. So I obviously got to know the area incredibly well. And the role of us special branch officers within a specific area was obviously intelligence gathering, but we also went on the ground. We didn't necessarily just intelligence gather. We went out because it's very great intelligence is often covered right at the rock face. We would have contacts with insurgents, capture one. That's where you got some of your most vital intelligence immediately from the fellow who maybe not wounded. But we always used to look what they called was called a crash RV, a crash rendezvous. They built into their system was that if they were contacted by the Rhodesian security forces, the ones who survived fled and always ended up in a specific place to regroup. Now, if we could find that out very rapidly, we obviously could continue it was a force multiplier. We could continue the whole. In Enterprise, we operated largely on motorcycles because of it's a fairly flat area, sandy, and they were made following up and travel that incredibly quick. And it was actually used in other areas, but I think our area was particularly suited. One of the things that also the hierarchy eventually realized in early 78 was the farmers in that area all were subject to call up. Many of them were in specialized units like the Sleuth Scouts or the SAS or the RLI or whatever. They were all told, right, you're a hot area, you're a frontline area, you join the local. Many people used to call it our citizen army. So I had people to call on with all sorts of specialities and knowledge and experience, which made it absolutely great. And our little band at Enterprise, you've read my thing, that defended that area with help from the heavy forces when needed. But it basically, we never lost anybody farmer chased off the land there, because we were able to defend it to that extent. That was not. It was a little unique. I think it didn't happen in too many other areas. But it was just nothing much to do with me. It was just the area was one of those places. But my role was to gather as much intelligence as possible. With the way we did it, I established sources. Luckily, because the Enterprise area and the surrounding, what we used to call then tribal trust lands, communal lands where the black people lived, was fairly close to Salisbury. Most of them commuted. So they'd have a job in the city and they would go home at weekends. So I was able to cultivate and meet up with them in the city where they were not under eyes of people who might be suspecting that they knew things. Obviously, I didn't do it myself. I used my black detectives, of which I had 6 or 7 of them. Great guys. They did that sort of real intelligence. My role was coordinating that kind of intelligence gathering and then collating it and then putting up to we all had joint operation commands in each area. Ours was actually in Salisbury. And we would report all that, and then based on the fact of that would go to combined operations, and they would say, right, here we go. And that's how Operation Enterprise came about. Our intelligence became so overwhelming and so authentic that the combined operations realized that we needed a RLI fire force and a big one in a big hurry. Otherwise, Salisbury was going to be hammered even worse than it had been already, with the oil storage tank fires and various other attacks around the city. So that's basically how intelligence works. Like anything in intelligence gathering, you get your unique sources. I had a guy who was a businessman, and he had various small shops within the area of around Enterprise, the tribal trust lands. But he saw no harm. He was actually a ZANU-PF, Mugabe supporter. But being a businessman, he saw no reason not to profit from the rewards we offered on information leading to. So and he had telephonic contract with me, and we would call. In those days, out in the enterprise, there were party lines. In other words, you had several people on a particular line, but we established a very good code how to work, and he would get hold of me, and I would get hold of him and say, right, and he would give me various bits of information which I would follow up on, and I was then able to allocate the required forces to that particular area. The Sleuth Scouts worked a lot, because if I was able to tell them where there was a group operating in their pseudo role, in their pretend to be a terrorist role, they would infiltrate that area and establish themselves and be able to watch, and then at the appropriate time call for aerial envelopment of that particular area. We had a lot of success with that. We also had the Poor Man's Fire Force, which was the Police Reserve Air Wing, which was essentially civilian aircraft, mostly Cessna 206s, single engine, with a pilot and a gunner. And in the gun was a twin barrel Browning 303, not even a 300 like you guys used to have, the 303, the old British standard one out of the Vampire jets. And that little aeroplane became a very, very useful, if not for kills, if we were following up on a group and the aircraft could find them in the bush or in the whatever, and they could put ground fire down on them, they tended to go to ground and stay there, which gave us time to catch up very quickly. They did score some amazing, it's not easy to hit somebody from that height from 700 feet with a machine gun while being shot at as well. But they gave us a great assistance in that particular aspect. So it was. That's why you say it's actually unique, Paul. It was a mixture of the most extraordinary, irregular, regular forces all pulling together, and getting on. And our emphasis was, let's do the job.
You mentioned a bunch of things there that I would love to dig into real quick. One of them is how you used some of the local farmers who had several talents, depending. There was a story you told about, I believe, a truck filled with insurgents traveling down a road, and you were able to call ahead to one of the farmers. And I believe you basically said, can you take these guys out, right? I heard this story and I said, wow, I don't think I've heard of any other law enforcement agency that could be able to pull that one off, just calling ahead to a local and saying, hey, could you take these guys out? Could you talk about that story a little bit?
Yeah, it was that was the gang who actually rocketed the fuel depots in Harare and set them alight. We had a lot of intel on them. I won't go into the background of why that has happened, and it could have been prevented, but anyway, that's a long story. However, we did detect that they were going to leave Harare in a cover, what we call a pickup. It's a ute or whatever you want to call them, covered back so that they could be concealed. But remember, there's a curfew. Travel after 6 a.m. and before 6 p.m. on roads was completely prohibited. And we had a roadblock up at the junction of a road that led out of Salisbury, going towards the tribal trust land. They were, with all due respect, a sleepy bunch of police general headquarters staff, basically in the treasury or the finance or whatever. I don't blame that for a moment. But they just weren't awake. And this truck came down the road, so they lazily got into thinking, well, this is some farmer going home, and got the fright of their lives when they were given a hiding of note from the guys in the back of the truck. So that, our early warning, thank God, set that off. They then took a wrong turning further down the road, and an alert farmer called me. We had a wonderful thing called Agric Alert, which every single farm homestead had a radio system who could call each other, and where I was at the enterprise base at the control center at any time, and say they were being attacked, or describe what was happening, or issue a concern, or whatever it was. And roll call was carried out twice a day. So if somebody doesn't come in and roll call at 6 in the evening, immediately we would dispatch a response to find out whether it was just a simple radio breakdown or whether there'd been a problem or whatever, or he'd had too many beers and gone to sleep. So this particular occasion, the truck went through. So Owen Connor and his son, who had actually served in the Grey Scouts at that particular point, were the last farm before the tribal trust land started. Owen was a fierce warrior. I've actually done some interviews on his behalf on Fighting Men in Rhodesia, and telling some of his stories. Owen's now 86 or 87, and he felt more comfortable me doing them for him on his, what he wrote for me. But we could always rely on Owen. Anyway, so I got hold of him and said, Owen, this is what's happening. It appears to be a vehicle coming down the road. We've no idea who they are, but they have firearms. Obviously, they'd fired upon the roadblock. The farmer halfway along had also reported, and when he said, these guys, I don't know who they are, but they're coming up my road, I said, fire on them, which he did. At long distance, it was like 400, 300, 400 meters. Nevertheless, the guys got the vehicle, obviously got the message, went back onto the main road and went down the road, where Owen and Kevin were then waiting in the ditch in a culvert right next to the road as it went past. Their house was probably a kilometer off the road, but they'd run up there with their weapons. Because everyone had their weapons at that point. There was no question. Everybody had. We used the Fabrique Nationale, the 762 NATO, and they went, and as this vehicle came through, they gave it a hiding of note, and it crashed in the ditch about 150 meters down. Owen was all set to go down there, do further harm to the vehicle, and I said, Owen, now just stop it, stop, stay right there. We'll be there in 10 minutes. It's not worth losing, guys. You've done the job. You've got the vehicle off the road. Hopefully, there's some casualties in there. And let's just let the armored vehicles come, and we'll take it over from there. Well, it was the gang from the fuel depots, and we came across the first ever 3.5 British military anti-tank rocket in there, which is actually what they'd used on the. We were used to the Russian RPG-7s and all that kind of stuff, but this was a 3.5, which was a big beast. And that's the first one we ever found. We subsequently found others around the place, but that was extraordinary. That's what I mean about the coordination of the people. Everyone was on the go, and Valor would be called up at any particular time to take on any task. Owen and Kevin subsequently got a bravery award, as they well deserved it.
And you just mentioned something about the RPGs, right?
Yes.
I am curious, through your intelligence gathering, maybe through prisoners that you captured from the insurgents or anything like that, did you find any information about Chinese, Russian, communist, Cuban involvement on the insurgent side?
Yeah, look, the situation was that the ZAPU, who is the Joshua Nkomo affiliated faction of the insurgents, who operated from Zambia, were fully Russian supported and Cuban, to the extent they actually had Cuban pilots allocated to what was a rudimentary air force, which never worked, which probably was a good thing. So within the country did come across obviously evidence of that in terms of the weapon numbers and all that kind of stuff. The guys doing the externals, like the SAS and the Sleuth Scouts and whatever, came upon it all the time. When they did that the raid of the camp north of Lusaka, they recovered a Russian general's cap. They recovered. There's no question that a couple of Russian advisors were killed in that. So that became very. On the other side of it, on Mugabe's side, they was totally Chinese supported. And once again, it was not unusual to come across Russian Chinese paraphernalia, personal paraphernalia, in the external raids. Where Enterprise, we came across. We did actually. Yes, he was a guy of mixed race. And was clearly an instructor amongst the Mugabe faction. We suspect he was Ethiopian, but obviously Chinese trained. And we actually captured him, And he gave us a lot of information on what had happened as to where the camps were training, whether the early days of the Mugabe guys, some of them went actually and were trained in China, properly trained in China, of the older generation. The younger ones were trained in Tanzania and then in Mozambique. And fortunately, the level of training, as the numbers grew, became less and less effective, which is why our casualty rate is disproportionately untrue of what should be a conventional, well, not a conventional, but a proper guerrilla war, because essentially they were thrown in as cannon fodder. But just as we did encounter on the domestic front and within our own military, American and British espionage at quite a high extent. I personally dealt with a very good fella. He had several Purple Hearts, ex-Green Beret from Vietnam, who came and joined. We had at that point, the farmers could recruit armed militia from either injured or wounded Rhodesians to protect their homesteads, both black and white. We had wounded RAR guys, we had wounded SAS guys, we had all sorts of guys who took that up as a job. It was a paid job, and they generally did a particular good. But then we had the foreigners coming in. This particular guy was a very effective soldier. He used too many, well, I'm sorry, I'm totally generalized here, but we used to have to make sure he carried plenty of ammunition, because he tended to clear everything with a large amount of ammunition. But he was effective. I mean, he got stuck in. There's absolutely no problem. And in the end, it became accepted by we used to call them Partustrix, Police Anti-Terrorist Unit. That's simply what they were labeled. It was not. They were soldiers, professional soldiers. And he became integrated, but obviously he had another job to do. And one of my detectives watched him over a couple of days, and he was wandering around the helicopters that used to be on the ground at Enterprise. And we had map-Rhodesia cannons on those 20mm cannons, and he was caught surreptitiously writing down the serial numbers of the cannons. So I quietly spoke to my hierarchy, and a day or two later, the immigration department came out and made a song and dance about checking guys' papers and whatever. They got hold of him and said, well, we just need to take you back just to confirm your papers or whatever. I subsequently heard he owned up and confessed he was a CIA, and he was shipped out the country, and that was it. From the British intelligence point of view, it was far more serious. It's a controversy I don't think we'll ever settle, as to whether we were infiltrated by British intelligence to such an extent that many operations, the external operations, were compromised, and why Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo were never successfully killed, despite intelligence being absolutely 100% as to where they were at a particular time. But when the operation went in, all of a sudden they weren't. So that's for another time. That is and Hannes is particularly strong on this one. And I think he's right. But I think we're probably accusing the hierarchy as the wrong suspects. I think it was at a lower level than that. I think there was skillful infiltration, because we were obviously ex-British colony. We had a lot of ex-British servicemen come and join. Most of them, without exception, first-class soldiers. Many of them stayed here and eventually went to serve in South Africa as well. But there were a few. There's no question. A few must have got into the woodwork and were feeding back our intentions. To the extent we're late in the war. One external op, it was a small one. It was kept utterly secret, other than the 5 people who planned it. It was a huge success, which had to make a point. So you talk about the Chinese, Russian, but also you lot and the POMs were heavily involved here.
It seems to me, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about this. I mean, when you think of like the Cold War, this is really ground zero of the Cold War right now happening.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. That was, you know, we, and to a certain extent, South Africa later than us, were right in the crunch of the jaws of that ending Cold War before it actually happened. And you know, I think we were pawns in the whole thing. You know, we were a proud nation, grown up of pioneers. Weren't going to take this lying down. And let me just assure you that first general election, which once again my utter distrust for politicians of any sort, Maggie Thatcher, who'd taken over as Prime Minister of the UK at that particular point, a Conservative Prime Minister, and had promised that had that first election been regarded by her monitoring team as free and fair, she would accept the result that Rhodesia could remain a self-governing colony and work its own way towards independence on a on negotiating terms with everybody. Her team went back and said, that is the freest and fairest election I have ever seen in many parts of the world, and particularly Africa. The Nigerians threatened to nationalize the oil fields in Nigeria. Maggie, who's supposed to have a pair of balls, suddenly didn't have, and reneged on us. So that was the great tragedy of that. I think Rhodesia, or whatever it would have become, would have been a very different place had politicians not dropped us in it like that.
No, I absolutely hear you. And, you know, I know you all there were facing so many different challenges with your backs against the wall like that. One of the biggest challenges that I've seen, particularly with the United States involving intelligence gathering in the global war of terror, was actually the dissemination of intel between different agencies. I mean, there's so many agencies that wanted to get involved in the global war on terror, including, you know, the CIA, Army intelligence, FBI, even the New York Police Department's own intelligence group. How did you sort of deal with the dissemination of intel between different units? I know you were talking about getting compromised there, so it seems to always be a challenge. How did you guys overcome that and have so many successful missions?
I think because we were a small community, everybody in the intelligence community tended to pull together. Special branch were pretty autonomous in the role that we'd had since the early 70s in terms of counter-insurgency intelligence. We had military intelligence, but they were more involved in the mapping, upgrading of you know, intelligence on the ground, trying to get us back to Mozambique, all that kind of stuff. Not involved too much on the actual nitty-gritty, because I think Special Branch had such a grip on that. That it was difficult to challenge us on that kind of aspect. CID, if they came across, as they did come across intelligence related to, would definitely pass it off to us, and not try and head off on their own tangent. So the intelligence feed from essentially Special Branch into the ComOps was pretty steady, and we had good guys in ComOps who collated the intelligence and then worked with for external intelligence, worked with the SAS and to a certain extent the Sleuth Scouts, and another agency which I must mention, which was the CIO, which was called the Central Intelligence Agency, a very quiet in the background agency that handled external sources. And there are quite a few books and instances on that, how they cultivated sources all over the world. I don't think we'd have got our Huey helicopters had it not been for personnel that they had in Israel. We worked not closely, not at my level, but certainly at upper level. Mossad were without question around and on our side to a certain extent, as much as any intelligence agency is. But I think that the problem we had was where this leak came. where the good intelligence would all be collated, the operation would be planned, everybody was good to go, the operation went, and all of a sudden, a warning. Look, the raid in Lusaka to get Joshua Nkomo, I mean, his soldiers got mowed down, but he was spirited out. So it was sacrifice. They were sacrificed just to protect him for whatever reason. We're still trying to work that out to this particular day. But we didn't have that. We didn't have enough units to have a real bad inter-rivalry. You had the old individuals, I mean, and they didn't last very long, who tried to say, I found this out and I want to deal with this. Well, he rapidly got slapped back into shape and told, you're part of the team, chap. Either be part of the team or go away.
Right, right. And something I would like to get into as well is, separate from the military, as you know, probably being in uniform branch or just going to the depot training or academy training, as we call it, and learning some of that basic police work, as you mentioned, getting to know your area, your neighborhood, your community. Did that ever give you sort of an edge, that police work, that police training? Did that ever give you an edge in intelligence gathering? Did any of those tasks help you with that?
I think so. I think the Rhodesian community, as it was, because it was relatively small. You must remember there were only ever 250,000 white people in Rhodesia at any one particular point at the height of the 70s. Essentially a village, in real terms. Most people knew each other, and it was not difficult to. There was a great sense of care for people, and whether you were uniform branch or whatever you were, if you had a problem and somebody phoned up and said, I've got this issue, the response was immediate. And I'm talking about black and white, didn't matter. If in the townships somebody said, I think there's somebody trying to break into my back door or whatever, the response was immediate. No questions asked. It wasn't can you fill in 25 forms and what size is your foot? It was simpler times then, Paul. It was very much simpler times. And the whole culture of the country was, we help each other, which I think made a massive difference. And yes, it did help in terms of the intelligence gathering, because you knew the people. I mean, I could walk into a particular, they call them a village. We call them crawls here, which is a typical local village area. And in 5 seconds, I could see that there was something unusual. The women were not in the right place. There were no adult men. The children were sitting in a group, very quiet, not being boisterous as they usually are. So you soon pick that whole pattern up. And that assisted greatly in intelligence gathering. We were proud of the fact that our intelligence gathering was certainly in my case, and I think without exception. I think there was one guy I gave a clout once, because he was particularly obstreperous and whatever. But our intelligence gathering was done on a we knew, and they knew we knew. So when I would sit somebody down and question him, the moment he said no, I said, well, don't talk rubbish. I know he's your cousin. So just stop, just stop the nonsense and let's just talk properly, and then we'll sort this whole thing out. And that became very true. When you've obviously seen stories that John has done of the guys in the Slew Scouts, and people have often said to me, astounding that you can take a guy who's shooting at you 4 hours earlier, now comes alongside and works with you against his comrades. Now, that was a simple technique that was developed by the very specialized special branch guys. And they knew, they would tell the guy where he trained, who his instructor was, when he'd been moved from one camp to another, who his parents were. Of course, they knew that straight away, and where they were at the moment. They might have been dislodged from their area because of the war, and they would tell them, well, they're down here in Salisbury, in one of the townships. Do you want to go see them? And that just floored them completely. And I think to a certain extent, 80% of the insurgents were to a large extent press gang, to make up numbers. They were the hardcore, and we did encounter these hardcore guys every now and again, and they were proper soldiers. And it was, it was then difficult, and you had to fight a proper battle. But unfortunately, a lot of them were press ganged and rudimentarily trained and poorly equipped. So it's yeah. I guess answering your question, I suppose it was we had such local knowledge of the country that it was not difficult to recognize when something was not right or wrong and ask the right question.
Now, as you've just shared some very clear successes, right? There were also some frustrations and ways not to do it, as I understand, when you were dealing with captured prisoners. I guess one of the stories is don't take a high-level captured prisoner, put them in a helicopter with a megaphone, and have him start yelling names of his comrades. I guess that doesn't quite work. Do you want to talk about that as an example, as a negative example? I don't know.
Yeah, he was one of our captures. In fact, he gave himself up. So he probably, he was a fairly reasonably sort of senior guy, but he's had enough of being chased around and shot at and all his comrades killed and whatever. So he actually surrendered. And there was a particularly bumptious fellow who in the army had a psychological operations unit, which I'm sure to use in those days was just a total misnomer. But he's trying to make a name for himself. So he pulled rank on me and my superior by getting up from the top on a story that this would help with the voting in the first general election and all the rest of it. Well, as you read in the whole story, it was the absolute opposite. All it did was anyone he called out on the either the aircraft had to get higher and higher as it was shot at more and more, but anyone he called out on the ground was then lauded by his comrades and the locals as they know you, they know who you are, you're famous. So absolutely counterproductive. Anyway, that fellow didn't last very long. I think he ended up being a storeman or something, but it was probably too elevated for him as well.
Well, in these moments of hard work and some of very intense moments, I know just like you mentioned during your depot training, there are some humorous moments. Are there any stories you can share about that?
Oh my God, yes. Enterprise, where I was stationed for all that, and in many other bases in the country, there was always the pub, the bar. Now, discipline was strict, but if you were off duty, and not likely liable for call out or anything like that during the night, you were allowed to go into the bar. That was fine, and the guys were pretty much, certainly during the wartime, you had your 3 beers and you had your supper, and off you went back to your bivvy or wherever you were. But only on a Thursday, we would change over. Either, for example, if the RLI was there, one commander would change with another commander for rest and recuperation, and our local guys, if we had what we called the A section in, B section would come in, so they would be on standby. So A section could let their hair down. So that became I actually changed the days afterwards because it became pretty obvious that on a Thursday half the buggers were useless. So we swapped it between days and made it a bit different. But being so close to Salisbury, we had a ex-engineer guy who'd been quite badly wounded in laying the mines along the what we call the cordon sanitaire, the mine, very like the Israeli minefield. But he was a character of note. He was absolute character. He was attached to us as a sort of supernumerary. But he knew all the strippers in town. And on most Thursdays, he would appear with the strippers of various quality at the bar, and the party would go. But one of the funniest stories about I ever recall of him, he generally didn't drink much at all. But I think one night he got a little bit tipsy, and he was taking the girls back in an armored vehicle we called a hyena. It was actually like a 3-ton truck with armored sides and all the rest of it, but it was a little bit precarious. It was a bit too top heavy. And going back down the road, he actually managed to throw it into the ditch. Luckily, the girls were strapped in, so they were fine, screaming and performing. We rapidly responded, pulled it back onto its wheels, and said to Dave, "Look, get on with dropping these girls off." So off he went, but he actually cut himself quite badly, which we didn't sort of realize at the time. So he thought he'd better. His wife, when he got back, he actually lived in that area. She said, no, you were taking you straight to the Andrew Fleming Hospital to get yourself stitched up. But no, he was still quite 15 sheets to the wind. And he went she took him into the cubicle, lay him down on the thing, and the nursing sisters came along and said, "Okay, we'll be with you shortly. You need stitches and all the rest of it." And the very efficient and bustling matron came along, a big lady, and had a look and said, "Oh, a soldier wounded, whatever, what's happened?" And all the rest of it. And he promptly stuck his hand up her skirt. Well, his injuries multiplied. And his wife was told in no uncertain terms to take him out of there and bring him back when he was sober. So we dined out on many stories like that. And there was another one I could tell you. There was a very well-known stripper who used to come out every now and then. She was comparatively expensive, so the guys all had to chip in and whatever. But on one particular case, she had a little fox terrier who was not part of the act, but he was just sort of around. And she was doing her thing on the middle of the sort of the floor, the hall floor in Enterprise. And the fox terrier went up to her and sniffed her in the nether regions and let go the biggest sneeze you have ever heard in your life. Well, the place just fell apart, and everyone, she and Amanda disappeared with the dog, and it was a show cut short, but everyone agreed it was money well spent for that particular one. I don't know whether you want to repeat these stories, but anyway.
I'm sure she never came back, huh?
She did. Oh no. It was a job for money, and then she came back. So yeah, we had our raunchy times, but like any war, that's what happens. But well, I would say that we never ever let the security of anything for lapse because of anything like that. If there was something going on that Thursday, it just never happened. So yeah,
right. But there is even now when we talk about police work or even in the military, I think it is important to have those moments where you can get the team to let their hair down a little bit, because if you're just go all the time, you're just going to wear people thin, and that's when accidents happen, when they're fatigued, overworked, I think.
Oh, totally. Now, we were lucky. It was not a Somme or like the First World War where you were continually stuck in the front in the mud and whatever. You had your times where there were lulls, and we did our best to give the guys as much time off and recreation as possible. And because a lot of our guys lived within the area, it was they'd maybe come in for one day and one night and then be able to go back for 5-6 days as we'd sorted the problem out. And it was very much when we need you, we need you. When we don't need you, go back and carry on your normal activities.
On that note, is there anything, I mean, especially for Americans who are not necessarily learning about the history of Africa, which is very important in world history, is there anything you'd like to tell them or people who might not know, just what should we be taking away from the conflict in Rhodesia? What are the big talking points, the learning points?
Okay, my biggest talking point, I would say from my personal point of view, is never trust a politician ever, no matter who he might be. Secondly, values. It's not necessarily true that old school is the best school, but certainly the days of my time there, values were family values, personal values, and comradeship were very good. And the whole notion that it was a black and white war was absolute rubbish. 85% of the Rhodesian security forces were black, volunteers, not conscripted. Most of the whites were conscripted, but the blacks were never, ever. And in fact, towards the end of the war, we could have formed another battalion of soldiers or of people who wanted to become a soldier. So it's not a case of it was a black-white war. It wasn't. The other thing was, many people accuse the white government or whatever of being intransigent in terms of the negotiations of the whole situation. I take it in a slightly different way. I agree there could have been concessions granted, but the problem was what the Rhodesian government never wanted is what happened to Zimbabwe in the years after that. Is that greedy politicians came in and just, that's what they wanted. They had empty pockets and they wanted to fill them. And they were a political group that had no care for the people whatsoever. I mean, the way they treated their own combatants, they were basically left destitute. And only when in 2000, when the ex-combatants on the nationalist insurgent side came up and stood one-to-one and said, no, we're sick and tired of this. You promised us stuff, now give it to us, which brought about the most unfortunate situation of the land reform in Zimbabwe, which basically ruined the country. Only now is it recovering. 13, 14 years later, is it starting to recover now? We've got competent farmers back on the land again. The grain production is picking up. We will be self-sufficient this year in maize and wheat. Our exports crops are growing. Now that was all destroyed by promises that Robert Mugabe had made to his own soldiers and reneged on. So if lessons are to be learned, I guess it's back to the old thing. You cannot trust a politician.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about this. Definitely have to have you on again. Is that possible?
Of course, Paul, of course. You know, there's a huge amount to talk about on this whole thing.
Absolutely. We're barely scratching the surface, but thank you so much.
Yeah. Pleasure, Paul. Great.